Emily Walker awoke at 6:30 a.m., as she did every weekday, to the soft ticking of her nightstand clock. Outside their two-story home in the Chicago suburb of Oak Park, the first rays of sunlight were filtering through the leaves of the old maple trees. The house, painted a soft cream color, with a neatly trimmed lawn and beds of peonies, looked like something out of a country life magazine. Neighbors walking their dogs often stopped to compliment Emily's flower gardens or ask how her children were doing. "You're such a perfect family," Mrs. Keller, an elderly woman from down the street, once said, and Emily smiled, hiding her weariness behind a polite "thank you." In the kitchen, the coffee maker hissing softly, Emily made breakfast: oatmeal with berries for Sophie, peanut butter toast for Lucas, and an omelet for Tom, who liked his eggs slightly underdone. She moved with the precision of a choreographer performing a familiar dance. The kitchen smelled of freshly brewed coffee and the warmth of home, but Emily barely noticed these details. Her mind was already racing, checking that Sophie had signed the release form for the school trip, reminding Lucas to pack his soccer kit, sending out an order for new beads for her jewelry business. Sophie, 13, with long brown hair, walked into the kitchen, her head glued to her phone. "Mom, have you seen my backpack?" she asked, her eyes still glued to the screen. Emily, without turning around, pointed to a chair by the door. "Where you left it yesterday." Sophie muttered something that sounded like "thank you" and began rummaging through her bag, making sure everything was in place. Lucas, a 9-year-old whirlwind of energy, ran in after her, already wearing a soccer jersey even though practice wasn't until the evening. "Mom, can I get 2 sandwiches for lunch? I was so hungry yesterday." Emily nodded, adding another sandwich to his lunchbox, making a mental note to buy more bread. Tom was the last to come down, wearing the navy suit Emily had ironed the day before. His blonde hair was neatly combed, and he was holding his briefcase and his phone, already scanning work emails. "Morning," he said, kissing Emily on the cheek, but his eyes were distant, as if he was already mentally at the construction site, where another project awaited him. Emily set a plate of scrambled eggs and a cup of coffee in front of him, knowing exactly how many spoons of sugar he preferred. "Don't forget, you have a meeting with the contractors at 3 today," she reminded him, and Tom nodded, murmuring, "Yeah, right, thanks." At first glance, their life was perfect. Tom, an engineer at a large construction company, provided the family with a stable income that allowed them not only to pay the mortgage, but also to save for college for their children. Emily, in addition to her roles as a mother and wife, developed her own small business. She created handmade jewelry, which she sold on Etsy and at local fairs. Her earrings and necklaces with semi-precious stones were in demand, and she even considered renting a space at a Christmas market in Chicago. Their children went to good schools, Sophie was in the drama club, and Lucas dreamed of becoming a professional football player. Friends and relatives often said that the Walkers were an example of what the American dream should look like. But behind that facade was another reality. Emily felt like a juggler balancing a dozen plates, knowing that if one fell, the whole thing would collapse. She was the one keeping the family on track, but no one noticed the cost. Tom, absorbed in his work, rarely asked how her day had been, and when he did, his eyes would flicker to his phone as she answered. The children, busy with their own affairs, took her care for granted, and Emily didn't blame them, they were just kids. But deep down, she felt a growing loneliness, like a quiet hum that grew louder when ignored. The morning passed as usual. Tom left for work, the children boarded the school bus, and Emily was left alone in a house that seemed too big for her thoughts. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop to answer customer orders, but instead she stared out the window where her neighbor, Mrs. Keller, was walking her Labrador. "The perfect family," she remembered the old woman saying, and a bitter smile touched her lips. Emily knew that perfection was an illusion that she maintained day after day, but nobody saw cracks that have already begun to appear under this glossy surface. She got up to pour herself more coffee and noticed a magnet on the refrigerator with a photo of their family taken last summer on Lake Michigan. They were all smiling. Tom with his arm around her shoulder, Sophie making faces, Lucas holding his fishing rod proudly, even though he had caught only seaweed. Emily had believed then that she could control everything, that her efforts were holding their lives together like glue. Emily stood at the kitchen island, methodically sorting through the school papers Sophie and Lucas had brought home last week. Outside in Oak Park, a light rain fell, the drops pattering softly against the glass, creating a rhythm as Emily sorted the papers. A museum permit for Sophie, a reminder to fundraise for soccer jerseys for Lucas, an application for the school drama club. Each document demanded her attention, a signature, a date, the occasional receipt. She opened her laptop to check her family's budget and added a reminder to her calendar for next Wednesday's parent-teacher conference. This was her life, an endless list of tasks that no one but her noticed. The kitchen, the heart of their home, was clean but not sterile. On the counter sat a vase of daisies Emily had picked up at a farmer's market to lively up the space, as a decor magazine had suggested. The refrigerator was covered with children's drawings and post-it notes with reminders. Dental, Lucas, 14th, Etsy order due Friday. Emily loved the kitchen, but sometimes it felt like a command center, the sole operator managing the chaos of their family life. Her day had started at 6:30, as usual, but by 10 she'd made breakfast, gotten the kids ready for school, answered 3 emails from her business clients, and done a load of laundry. Now, with the washing machine humming in the back, Emily opened her scheduling app to make sure she'd covered everything. Lucas needed a soccer kit today, and Sophie wanted her to stop by the grocery store to pick up paper for a school project. There was also dinner to make Tom like the smell of food in the house when he came home from work. Emily mentally calculated how many ingredients she had for lasagna and added ricotta and spinach to her shopping list. She didn't complain, at least not out loud. Emily had grown up believing that family was work and that a good wife and mother was supposed to be in control. Her own mother, Marge, had been the same way, always organized, always prepared, always smiling, even when Emily's truck-driving father was gone for weeks at a time. "You do it for them," Marge would say when Emily, as a teenager, asked how she was coping. And Emily had learned that lesson, perhaps too well. But being like Marge meant not only being organized, but also silently giving. Emily took care of everything from schoolwork to small things like reminding Tom of his coworkers' birthdays. When his boss, Mr. Henderson, got a promotion, it was Emily who ordered the birthday card and arranged for a small gift from their family. Tom thanked her, but only briefly, as if it was a given, and perhaps it was to him. Tom would come home around 7, tired but happy. His job at a construction company was demanding. Meetings with contractors, inspections at construction sites, endless reports. Emily respected his work, it provided for their family, allowed them to live in a nice neighborhood, and take their once-a-year vacation. But when he walked through the door, his day was over. He'd take off his jacket, hang it over the back of a chair, and sit on the couch with his phone or turn on the TV to watch the news. For Emily, the evening was just beginning. Dinner, helping Sophie with her homework, making sure Lucas remembered to brush his teeth. Even after the kids went to bed, she'd be on her laptop, answering orders or packing jewelry for shipping. Sometimes she found herself envious of Tom. Not his job, she knew he had his own stresses, but his ability to switch off. He could just be home, not worrying about whether the milk was out or whether Sophie needed an orthodontist appointment. Emily never switched off. Even in her sleep, her mind kept running through to-do lists like a broken record. She woke up at 3 in the morning one night, remembering she'd forgotten to buy glue for Sophie's school project, and lay there staring at the ceiling until she decided to get up and order it online. She had tried to talk to Tom about how hard it was for her. A couple of years ago, when Lucas was in kindergarten, she had mentioned feeling overwhelmed. "Maybe you should hire someone to help," Tom had suggested, genuinely trying to help. But Emily had shaken her head. For one thing, their budget didn't allow for a cleaner or a nanny, and for another, she couldn't imagine anyone else doing what she considered her responsibility. "I can handle it," she had said, and Tom had nodded, accepting that as the end of the conversation. He hadn't asked since. Emily didn't blame him, not really. Tom was a good father. He went to Lucas's football games, helped Sophie with her maths when she asked, and always brought home a cake on her birthdays. But his contributions were episodic, like a guest who shows up at a party, makes a few flamboyant gestures, and leaves, leaving the organizer to clean up after everyone. Emily was that organizer, and no one noticed how much she worked her ass off to keep the party going. Today, standing at the kitchen island, she felt the fatigue wash over her like a wave. She looked at her hands, stained with ink from the pen she used to sign her school forms. On her ring finger glittered her engagement ring, a simple one with a small diamond, the one Tom had given her 15 years ago when he proposed on the shore of Lake Michigan. She had been in love then, full of hope, sure their life would be an adventure. Now the ring seemed just part of her uniform, like an apron or a laptop she couldn't leave the house without. She opened the fridge to get ingredients for dinner and noticed that Tom hadn't finished the salad she'd made the night before. It was a small thing, but it stung like a splinter. She'd spent an hour on that salad, picking out fresh vegetables from the market, mixing the dressing from a recipe she'd found on Pinterest. And Tom had just pushed it aside because he wasn't in the mood for greens. Emily closed the fridge door a little too tightly and then scolded herself. "Don't be silly," she muttered, but the irritation remained. Later, when the children returned from school, the house was filled with the usual noise. Sophie was complaining about the English teacher who doesn't understand Shakespeare at all, and Lucas was telling the story of how he scored a goal during recess. Emily listened, nodding, asking questions, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about driving Lucas to practice the next day and to the fair on Saturday, where she had rented a table to sell jewelry. She was thinking about Tom coming home, sitting on the sofa, asking what's for dinner, not noticing that Allie was spinning around like a squirrel in a wheel all day. When Tom finally walked into the house, his tie was slightly loose and his expression was tired. "It's been a hell of a day," he said, throwing his briefcase on a chair. Emily, stirring her lasagna sauce, nodded. "Yeah, I can imagine." She wanted to tell him about the fight Sophie had had with her friend, the customer who had returned her order because it was the wrong shade of turquoise, but Tom had already turned on the TV and the moment had passed. Emily looked at him sitting on the couch and felt something tighten in her chest. Not anger, not resentment, but something deeper, the realization that she was drowning in responsibilities, and the man who was supposed to be her partner didn't even notice how hard it was. Emily sat at her workbench in her small studio, a corner of the living room she had dedicated to her jewelry-making business. The table was littered with beads, wire, and tools, and in the center sat a half-finished pair of amethyst earrings that a client in California had ordered. It was getting dark outside in Oak Park, and the light from her desk lamp reflected off the purple stones, casting strange shadows on the wall. It was about 9 o'clock, the kids had gone to bed, and Tom was in the living room watching a basketball game, occasionally commenting on the game. Emily could have joined him, but instead she stayed here in her corner, where, for at least an hour, she could focus on something that was hers alone. But even here, among the beads and pliers, her thoughts returned to her marriage. She loved Tom, or at least she remembered loving him once, but over the years their relationship had become more of a contract than love. Emily tried to be the perfect wife, the kind people wrote about in magazines and talked about at family dinners. She cooked, cleaned, looked after the children, supported Tom in his career, even when it meant sacrificing her own desires. But the more she tried, the more she felt that he didn't see her not as Emily, a woman with dreams and feelings, but as a function, a part of the machine called the Walker family. Tonight was a typical evening. Tom arrived home at 7:15, a little later than usual because of the highway traffic. Emily met him in the kitchen, where she was finishing up dinner herb roasted chicken and baked potatoes, because Tom had once said that was his favorite. She set the table, called the children, and they ate together like a normal family. Sophie talked about her role in the school play, Lucas bragged about how he almost scored a goal in practice, and Tom shared a story about a coworker who messed up the plans at a construction site. Emily smiled, asked questions, refilled glasses of water, but inside she felt like an actress playing the role of a caring wife. After dinner, Tom put the dishes in the dishwasher, his standard contribution to the household, then settled on the couch with his phone, checking the scores. Emily stayed in the kitchen, wiping down the countertops even though they were already clean. She could have asked him to help with other things like checking Lucas's homework or folding the laundry, but she didn't. Past experience had taught her that Tom would do it, but in a way that suggested she was asking him for a great favor. "I'm on my feet all day," he'd said once when she'd asked him to drive Sophie to drama class, and from then on Emily was careful not to ask unless she absolutely had to. She returned to the earrings, trying to focus on her work. Her business, small as it was an outlet. Making jewelry made her feel like not only a mother and a wife, but also someone who could create something beautiful. She had started the business 5 years ago, when Lucas was in kindergarten, and it had been growing slowly but surely. Customers left glowing reviews on Etsy, and at a recent craft fair in Chicago, she had sold almost all of her pieces. But even that accomplishment seemed insignificant in the context of their family life. Tom rarely asked about her business, and when he did, it was mostly out of politeness. "How are your beads?" he said once, and Emily smiled and replied, "Good," even though inside she wanted to scream that these weren't just beads, but her passion, her work. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the television. Tom had turned up the volume as a commercial came on. Emily glanced toward the living room, where he was leaning back on the couch, a bottle of beer in his hand. She knew he was tired. His job was tough. Endless meetings, deadline pressure, arguments with contractors. He often came home with headaches, and Emily tried to be understanding. But her own fatigue, invisible and intangible, was building up somewhere deep inside, like water in a cracked jug, ready to spill out at any moment. She thought back to their early years, when they were first married. Tom had been different then, or maybe she had been different. They had met at a dorm party during their sophomore year at the University of Illinois. Tom was tall, blonde, with an easy smile and a way of telling a story that made everyone laugh. Emily had been drawn to his confidence, not in a pompous way, but in a quiet way, like he knew exactly what he wanted out of life. They had started dating, spending their nights walking around campus, dreaming about the future. Tom had wanted to be an engineer, to build bridges and buildings that would be left behind. Emily had dreamed of becoming a designer, but after they got married and had Sophie, those dreams had fallen by the wayside. She didn't regret it, or at least she convinced herself she didn't, but sometimes, looking at her old sketches, tucked away in a box in the attic, she felt a twinge of longing. Their life is different now. The love that had once seemed so vibrant had become routine, a set of expectations and obligations. Emily knew Tom loved her in his own way. He brought flowers on their anniversary, fixed the faucet in the bathroom when it started to leak, and always complimented her cooking. But his love was superficial, as if he saw only the results of her efforts, a clean house, happy children, hot meals, and not the woman who was behind it all. Emily, for her part, tried to live up to his expectations. She took care of herself, did her hair even when she didn't plan to leave the house, bought dresses she knew he liked. But it was all part of the role. She played the perfect wife, always ready, always smiling, always delivering. She finished the earrings and carefully placed them in a velvet box to ship. Glancing at the clock, she realized it was almost 10. She needed to check that the kids were asleep and fold the laundry that was waiting in the dryer. She stood up, stretched, feeling the muscles in her shoulders ache, and went upstairs. Sophie's room was dark, the only light from her phone illuminating her face as she scrolled through Instagram, despite the no devices after 9 rule. Emily gently took the phone away, whispering, "Go to sleep. You have an early start tomorrow." Sophie muttered something disgruntled, but turned over on her side. Lucas's room was silent, asleep, hugging the teddy bear he didn't recognize as his own, but refused to throw away. Back downstairs, Emily passed the living room, where Tom was still watching television. "I'm going to bed," she said, pausing in the doorway. He nodded, his eyes still on the screen. "Yeah, I'll be right there too." Emily waited for him to look at her, maybe smile, but he didn't. She turned and walked upstairs, feeling something heavy settle in her chest. It hadn't been the first night like this, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But every time Tom stayed on the couch, and she went to bed alone, she felt a little more invisible, a little more cut off from the man who had once promised to be with her in joy and in sorrow. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the clock tick. She thought about how their marriage had become like a job, not the kind you enjoy, but the kind you do because otherwise everything will fall apart. Emily closed her eyes, trying to remember the last time she felt like she wasn't a wife or a mother, but just herself. But the memory slipped away like a dream you forget the moment you wake up. Emily lay in the darkness of their bedroom, staring at the shadows cast by the streetlight through the curtains. It was nearly midnight, and the Oak Park house was silent, save for the occasional creak of a floorboard or the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. Tom slept beside her, his breathing even almost inaudible, his hand casually draped over the sheet between them. Emily stared at his silhouette, trying to remember the last time she'd felt the warmth of his presence, but instead she felt only emptiness, as if an invisible wall had grown between them. An hour ago, after they'd gone to bed, Tom had turned toward her, his arm sliding around her waist as he pressed a soft kiss to her neck. It was a familiar ritual, repeated once or twice a week when he was in the mood. Emily knew what he wanted, and as always, she hadn't said no. She never said no, even when her body and mind were screaming at her about exhaustion. It was part of her role to be available, to support their marriage, to preserve what she believed to be the core of their family. But today, as she had for the past few years, she lay there, letting it all happen, her mind wandering elsewhere to her to-do list for tomorrow, to Sophie's school project, to the Etsy order that needed to be sent by Friday. When it was over, Tom mumbled something like, "I love you," and fell asleep almost immediately, turning over on his side. Emily lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling her body slowly return to reality. She felt no pleasure or closeness, just a tired detachment, as if she had just completed another task on her endless list. It was a feeling she was familiar with, but it felt heavier each time, like a weight she was carrying around with no place to put it. She turned her head to look at Tom. In the dim light, his face seemed softer, younger, almost like she remembered it from their early years. Back then, in their tiny apartment in Evanston, intimacy had been something alive, full of laughter and spontaneity. They would wake up in the middle of the night because one of them wanted to talk or just be together, and those moments felt magical. But after Sophie was born, and then Lucas, something had changed. At first, Emily had chalked it up to exhaustion babies, sleepless nights, moving to a new house. She'd thought it was temporary, that they'd get back to that old spark, but as the years passed, the spark faded until it was just an ember that she kept alive out of a sense of duty. Emily didn't blame Tom, not really. He wasn't cruel or inconsiderate in any obvious way. He remembered anniversaries, sometimes brought flowers for no reason, and always took care of the children when she was sick. But his attention to their intimacy was one-sided, as if he didn't notice that she wasn't involved in these moments the way he was. He never asked if she wanted it or if she was in the mood, and Emily didn't know how to start the conversation. She was afraid that telling the truth that intimacy had become routine for her would destroy something fragile in their marriage, so she kept quiet, letting him think everything was okay, even when her heart was elsewhere. She got out of bed, careful not to break the floorboards, and put on her robe. She needed to get out of the bedroom to clear her head. In the living room, she turned on the floor lamp and sat on the couch, hugging her knees. Her laptop was on the coffee table, next to a pair of beads she'd forgotten to put away after working on the jewelry. She picked up one of them, a turquoise one with a soft sheen, and twirled it in her fingers, trying to focus on something tangible. But her thoughts kept returning to Tom, to their marriage, to how she'd gotten to this point where even the most intimate moments felt empty to her. She remembered trying to talk to her friend Lisa about how she felt once, a couple of years ago. They were sitting at a cafe in downtown Chicago while the kids were on a school field trip. Lisa, divorced and happily single, listened as Emily fumbled for words, trying to explain that she no longer enjoyed being intimate with Tom. "Maybe you just need some time to yourself," Lisa suggested, but Emily shook her head. Time to herself sounded like a luxury she couldn't afford. Lisa shrugged. "Well, marriage is work. Sometimes you have to fake it until you feel better." Emily nodded, but her friend's words only made her feel more guilty. She didn't want to fake it, but what if that's what everyone did? Emily glanced at her watch, snapping back to reality. It was 12:47. She knew tomorrow would be a tough day. A morning call with a client, a school meeting, Lucas's practice. But instead of going back to bed, she stayed on the couch, hugging her pillow. She remembered a moment from their honeymoon when she and Tom were lying on the beach in Mexico, looking at the stars. He'd turned to her and said, "I want you to be happy forever." Emily had believed him then, but now the words seemed empty. She wasn't unhappy, not exactly, but the happiness she'd once felt had dissolved into routine, into the endless woulds and shoulds. She thought about how their intimacy had become a symbol for everything that was wrong with their marriage. It wasn't just physical distance. It was a reflection of how Tom had stopped seeing her as a person. He didn't notice when she was too tired to talk, or when her smile was strained. He didn't ask her what she wanted, not just in bed, but in life. And Emily, in turn, didn't know how to tell him that she wanted more attention, more partnership, more of a sense that she was more than just a function in their family. She stood up and went to the window, looking out at the dark street. The neighbor's house across the street glowed warmly, and Emily imagined another woman lying awake there, asking the same questions. She knew she wasn't the only one who felt this way, but that didn't make her loneliness any less poignant. She remembered her mother, Marge, once saying, "Marriage isn't about passion, it's about duty." Emily had been a teenager then, and she had thought that sounded terrible, but that was exactly how she lived now: duty, keeping her marriage going even when it was no longer her refuge. Back on the couch, she picked up her phone and opened her gallery, scrolling through old photos. There was her and Tom at graduation, laughing and sipping champagne. There was their wedding, with her in a white dress and him looking at her like she was the center of his world. There was Sophie, tiny in a pink jumpsuit, Tom holding her as gently as if she were glass. These moments were real, but they felt so far away, like they belonged to a different Emily, one who still believed love could be easy. She turned off her phone and put it on the table. She needed to sleep, but the thought of going back to the bedroom, to Tom, who wouldn't even notice she was gone, made her sad. She knew that in the morning everything would be as usual. She would get up, make breakfast, send the children to school, smile at Tom as he left for work. But each day like that took a piece of her, and she was afraid that soon there would be nothing left of her except this role wife, mother, organizer, who did everything to make their life look perfect. Emily closed her eyes, hugging the pillow to her chest. She didn't know how to change what was happening, but she felt like something inside her was already beginning to crack, like ice under a spring, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to stop it or let it destroy everything she had worked so hard to build. Emily sat on a bench near the soccer field, watching Lucas dribble after the ball, his sneakers flashing across the mud-stained grass. The autumn air in Oak Park was cool, and she pulled her coat tighter around her, feeling the wind creep under her collar. Around her, other parents were chatting, discussing schoolwork or weekend plans, but Emily was silent, lost in her own thoughts. Her eyes wandered absently across the field, but her mind was spinning the same endless to-do list. Pick up Sophie from drama class in an hour, buy groceries for dinner, respond to an email from a client who wanted her necklace redesigned, and make sure she'd made Lucas's dental appointment, and remind Tom about his meeting with his boss next week. The list was her constant companion, like a shadow that couldn't be driven away. But today, there was something else mixed in with the usual weariness, a quiet but stubborn resentment that was growing inside her like a snowball, growing heavier with each passing day. She couldn't say exactly when it had started, but she knew it wasn't a new feeling. It had been growing for years, fed by little moments that, taken individually, seemed insignificant, but added up to something Emily could no longer ignore. Last night, after dinner, she asked Tom to help Sophie with her algebra homework because she was busy packing an Etsy order. Tom agreed, but 20 minutes later, Emily heard Sophie say in an irritated voice, "Dad, you're not explaining it at all." When Emily walked into the living room, she found Tom on the phone and Sophie frowning as she tried to figure out the equation herself. "I asked you to help," Emily said, trying to sound calm but with pent-up frustration. Tom looked up, surprised. "I was helping, but she won't listen." Emily bit back the sharp retort that was on the tip of her tongue and sat down with Sophie to explain the problem. Later, after the kids had gone to bed, she wanted to talk to Tom, but he was already watching some Netflix show and the moment had passed. This was just one of many. Tom wasn't lazy or indifferent, he went to work, fixed the faucet when it broke, and always wished her a happy birthday. But his involvement in the family was spotty, as if he could plug into their lives when it suited him and unplug when he wanted. Emily didn't have that luxury. She was always on duty, and no one noticed how exhausting it was for her. Especially Tom. She remembered another moment, a couple of weeks ago, when she and Tom had gone to bed. As usual, he'd moved closer to her, his hand on her thigh, and Emily, feeling the familiar heaviness in her chest, had just let it happen. She hadn't wanted to not because she didn't love Tom, but because her mind was overloaded, thinking about the electric bill, about Lucas's ruined sneakers, about the angry customer leaving a review about a late delivery. But she hadn't said no, because she knew it was important to Tom, and she didn't want to disappoint him. When he'd fallen asleep with his arms around her, Emily had lay there with her eyes open, feeling empty, like she'd given away a part of herself without getting anything in return. This feeling of giving without receiving became the core of her resentment. Every time she consented to intimacy without wanting it, it was like another drop in a cup that was slowly but surely filling. She wasn't angry at Tom for wanting her, that was natural, part of marriage. But she was angry that he didn't notice her withdrawal, didn't ask if she was okay, didn't see her drowning in her responsibilities. He took her consent for granted as part of their life, and Emily, in turn, allowed him to think that way because she was afraid the truth would destroy their fragile equilibrium. On the soccer field, the coach blew the whistle and the game stopped. Lucas ran to the bench, his cheeks flushed from running. "Mom, did you see how close I came?" he asked, grabbing a bottle of water. Emily smiled, though her mind was elsewhere. "I saw you did well." Lucas ran back, and she looked at the other parents laughing and cheering for their children. She felt disconnected from them, as if her life was different, harder, even though it was outwardly no different. She thought of her mother, Marge, who had always seemed so tough. Marge had raised Emily and her brother alone while their father was away on missions, and she never complained. Emily remembered asking her mother once, as a teenager, if she was tired. Marge had just laughed. "Tired is a luxury, honey. You do what you have to do, period." Emily had admired her strength then, but now, as an adult, she understood the price that came with that strength. She didn't want to be like Marge, suffering in silence, hiding her feelings, but she was becoming more like her every day. The resentment toward Tom grew, not just because of his lack of attention to her workload, but because of the way he took her efforts for granted. Last week, she hosted a dinner party for his coworkers, spending 2 days planning the menu and cleaning the house. Tom had been thrilled, praising her in front of everyone, but when the guests left, he simply went to bed without helping with the dishes. Emily stood in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, loading the dishwasher, and felt something inside her clench. She didn't want gratitude, but she wanted him to notice how much she contributed to their lives, to say, at least once, "I see how hard this is for you, let me help." She knew that part of the problem was her. She could have said no when she didn't want intimacy. She could have asked for more help. She could have insisted on talking. But every time she was about to do so, fear stopped her. What if Tom was hurt? What if he started to pull away? What if their marriage, already fragile, couldn't handle it? So she kept quiet, letting the hurt grow like a weed, slowly but surely taking over a garden. On the pitch, play resumed, and Emily forced herself to focus on Lucas. She clapped when he made a good pass and even shouted, "Well done, Lucas," when he shot at goal. But her thoughts kept returning to Tom, to their marriage, to how she had gotten to this point, where even the love that had once been so bright had become a burden. She remembered how, at their wedding, Tom had promised to be with her through thick and thin. She had believed then that they would be equal partners, but now she felt alone in that promise, as if the grief was only hers. When practice ended, Lucas ran up, sweaty and happy. "Mom, can I get pizza for dinner?" he asked, and Emily nodded, even though she knew that meant another stop on the way home. They walked to the car, and Lucas chatted about his goal, about school, about his new friend who could juggle. The April evening in Oak Park was damp and cool, with the scent of damp earth and cherry blossoms wafting from the garden. Emily stood at the stove, stirring pasta sauce as the aroma of basil and tomatoes filled the kitchen. Plates were already laid out on the table, and Lucas's favorite garlic bun was baking in the oven. Sophie sat at the kitchen island, leafing through her English textbook, but her gaze kept wandering to her phone, where the blinking notification from her friend was more interesting than Shakespeare. Lucas had left his dirty sneakers by the door from his workout and was doodling on a piece of paper, humming a commercial. It was a typical evening in the Walker house, but Emily felt something taut inside her, like a string about to snap. She was tired. Not just physically, though her shoulders ached from the day before, lugging boxes of jewelry to the fair, but in a deep, exhausting, soul-deep way. The morning had started with discovering that Sophie had forgotten to do her school report, and she'd had to spend half an hour helping her find materials while Lucas whined that he wanted pancakes instead of oatmeal. Then there'd been a call from a client who wanted a refund on a bracelet because it didn't look right in the photo. Emily had spent an hour sorting out the return, even though she knew it would hurt her budget. And she'd reminded Tom about his contractor appointment because, as usual, he'd forgotten to put it on his calendar. These were small things, but they added up to a mountain of things that Emily felt buried under. Tom arrived home later than usual, around 8. His jacket was slightly rumpled, and his expression was tired and irritated. "It's been a terrible day," he said, throwing his briefcase on a chair and loosening his tie. Emily nodded, setting a plate of pasta in front of him. "Yeah, I can imagine." She didn't ask what had happened, because she knew he would either tell her himself or be lost in his thoughts, and either way, her own day would go unnoticed. Tom sat down at the table, and they ate, exchanging short conversations about school, work, and the weather. Sophie complained about her teacher. Lucas told her about how the coach had complimented him on a pass, and Tom mentioned that his project was delayed because of a supply problem. Emily listened, smiling, but her mind was elsewhere, on her to-do list, on her fatigue, on the feeling that she was dissolving into this routine. After dinner, the kids went to their rooms, and Emily began clearing the table. Tom loaded the dishwasher as usual, but then headed into the living room, where he turned on the TV. Emily felt a familiar pang of resentment rise in her chest as she wiped the countertops. She knew she could have asked him to help with something else, like checking to see if Lucas had done his homework, but she didn't. She was tired of asking, tired of being the one always telling people what to do. Instead, she finished cleaning in silence, listening to the sportscaster's voice drifting into the living room. She was about to go into her studio to finish a pair of earrings when Tom appeared in the kitchen doorway. His gaze was different from his usual one, not distracted, not tired, but somehow attentive, almost concerned. "Emily, are you okay?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. She paused, holding a tea towel in her hands, and looked at him. The question caught her off guard. Tom rarely asked how she was feeling, and usually she brushed it off, saying, "I'm fine," because it was easier that way. But today, something in his tone, or maybe in her own tiredness, prevented her from answering in her usual way. "I'm just tired," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. She turned to the sink to rinse out her sponge, but Tom didn't leave. "You've been quiet lately," he continued, more curious than accusatory. Emily felt something inside her clench. She didn't want to have this conversation, not now, not when she was on the verge of breaking down. But Tom took a step closer, and she knew he wasn't going to back down. "Quiet?" she asked, turning to face him. Her voice was calm, but there was tension in it. "I'm just doing what I have to do, Tom. Like I always do." She meant it to sound innocuous, but the words came out harsher than she'd intended. Tom frowned, as if he hadn't expected that answer. "What does that mean?" he asked, crossing his arms. Emily looked at him, and in that moment all her fatigue, all the years of silence, all the hurt she'd been hiding, suddenly rose to the surface like bubbles in boiling water. She dropped the towel on the counter and turned to face him. "It means I'm tired of being the one keeping this family afloat," she said, her voice shaking, but she kept going. "I do everything, Tom. I keep track of the kids, the house, your appointments, my business. I even remind you when your mom's birthday is. And you come home, sit on the couch, and your day is over. Mine never is." Tom looked stunned, as if she had spoken a foreign language. He opened his mouth to reply, but Emily continued, feeling the words she had been holding in for so long finally spilling out. "Do you ever ask how I'm coping? Or do you notice that I'm on edge? I'm not complaining because I know you're working too, but I can't be everything to everyone anymore, Tom. I just can't." She paused, breathing heavily, and looked at him, waiting for a reaction. Tom was silent, his gaze fixed on her, but there was no anger in it, only confusion and something like pain. "I didn't know you felt this way," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Emily laughed, but it was bitter, almost hysterical. "Did you? When Tom? When you check your phone at dinner? Or when you fall asleep 5 minutes after we go to bed? I've tried, but you won't listen." She felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she brushed them away, not wanting to show weakness. "And you know what's the worst part? I'm not even sure you notice how distant I am, even in bed." The last words had slipped out by accident, and Emily immediately regretted them. She hadn't meant to go this far, hadn't meant to touch on the subject, but now the words hung in the air like smoke that couldn't be cleared away. Tom froze, his face grew paler, and he slowly lowered his hands. "What do you mean?" he asked, and there was something fragile in his voice, as if he were afraid of the answer. Emily turned away, feeling her cheeks burn. She hadn't been ready to have this conversation, but it was too late to back out. "I mean, I don't always want to, Tom," she said, keeping her voice low so the children wouldn't hear. "But I do it because I think it's the right thing to do, because I'm your wife and I have to. But it's not like it used to be, and you don't even notice that I'm not with you, not really." The silence that followed her words was deafening. Emily could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the hum of the refrigerator, but she didn't dare look up at Tom. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if she'd just revealed a secret that was meant to stay buried. When she finally looked at him, his face was unreadable, but his eyes were shocked. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Emily nodded, feeling something inside her crumble. She wanted to take it back, to say it was just fatigue, that she hadn't meant it, but she couldn't. For the first time in years, she was being honest, and the honesty was both liberating and terrifying. Tom was silent, looking at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. Then he turned away, ran a hand through his hair, and said, "I need to think." Without another word, he walked into the living room, leaving Emily alone in the kitchen. She stood there, clutching the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white, her heart pounding, her head whirlwind of thoughts swirled around her. What had she done? What would happen now? She wanted to run after him, to explain, to soften her words, but her legs wouldn't move. Instead, she slowly sank into a chair, feeling her whole world, so familiar and stable, begin to crack at the seams. Emily sat at the kitchen table, clutching a cold mug of tea. The light overhead cast harsh shadows on the countertop, where crumbs from the dinner she hadn't cleaned up lay. It was about 10 o'clock at night, and the house in Oak Park seemed unusually quiet. The kids were asleep. The television in the living room was silent, and Tom, after their conversation an hour ago, had gone down to the basement where he kept a small office. Emily had heard the door creak as he came down the stairs, and there had been no sound since. She looked at her mug, where the tea had settled to the bottom, and felt her heart pound with a mixture of fear and relief. She had told the truth for the first time in years, but now it hung between them like a crack in glass, ready to widen at the slightest pressure. The conversation had come so suddenly that Emily still couldn't believe it had happened. She hadn't planned to spill the beans to Tom, hadn't planned to talk about how tired she was of being the invisible one in their family, how being intimate with him had become an obligation rather than a desire. But his question, "Are you okay?" and his insistence when she tried to brush him off had opened the floodgates she'd kept closed for so long. She'd said that she hadn't wanted intimacy for the past 5 years, that she'd only done it because she felt like it was her duty, that she felt like she was in charge of their lives rather than their partner. Each word was like a stone falling into water, sinking deeper and leaving ripples that grew wider. Now, sitting in silence, Emily tried to understand what she was feeling. Part of her was relieved she had finally gotten rid of this weight she had been carrying for years. She was no longer pretending, no longer lying to herself or to Tom. But another part, a large and frightening one, was terrified. What if she had ruined their marriage? What if Tom could never forgive her for saying those words? What if he looked at her differently, as a stranger, as the woman who had been deceiving him all these years? She hadn't been deceiving. Not really, she had simply been doing what she thought a good wife should do. But now, seeing his shocked face, she began to wonder if she had done the right thing. Emily stood up to pour herself a water, but paused at the sink, looking at her reflection in the dark window. Her face was pale, with shadows under her eyes, and her hair, usually neatly pulled back, was out of place in her ponytail. She looked older than she cared to admit, and it wasn't just tiredness. It was the reflection of a woman who had spent years putting others before herself until she forgot who she was. She turned away from the window and returned to the table, trying to collect her thoughts. She remembered how their conversation had ended. After she'd admitted she didn't want sex, Tom had asked, "Are you serious?" His voice was quiet, almost fragile, as if he were afraid she'd confirm it. When she'd nodded, his face had changed, not anger, not accusation, but something deeper, as if she'd punched him in the heart. He'd said, "I need to think," and walked away, leaving her in the kitchen. Emily wanted to run after him, to explain that she hadn't meant he was a bad husband, that it wasn't his fault, but her legs wouldn't move. She just stood there, listening to his footsteps fade away, feeling their world, so familiar and stable, begin to crumble. Now, in the quiet of the kitchen, she tried to figure out what she'd said and why it had hurt him so much. She didn't blame Tom for their problems, or at least she tried not to. He worked, he provided for the family, he was a good father. But his inattention to her workload, his habit of taking her efforts for granted, his failure to notice how she was drifting away, it had all been building up inside her for years. She told him how she felt invisible, how she had to be the one in control while he just got on with his life. She said that intimacy had become another task for her because he never asked if she wanted it and because she was too tired to want it. Emily knew her words were cruel, even if she didn't mean them to be. She saw Tom turn pale, his hands ball into fists, though he didn't raise his voice. She knew he took it as a betrayal, as if she'd pretended to love him all these years. But she loved him, or at least she thought she did. She just didn't know how to love him without losing herself at the same time. And now that she'd finally told the truth, she was afraid she'd lost him. She heard footsteps on the stairs and froze. Tom had risen from the basement, his silhouette appearing in the kitchen doorway. He looked haggard, his blonde hair disheveled and his shirt, usually neatly tucked in, now sticking out of his pants. He paused, looking at her, and Emily felt her heart tighten. She wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain, but the words were stuck in her throat. Tom spoke first, his voice low and strained. "I don't know what to say, Emily." She nodded, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. "Me too," she whispered, looking down at her hands, which were fiddling nervously with the edge of the tablecloth. Tom stepped closer, but he didn't sit down, instead remaining standing, leaning against the back of the chair. "Is that how you really feel, all these years?" he asked, and there was so much pain in his voice that Emily wanted to take it all back. "Yes," she said, forcing herself to look up. "I didn't mean for this to happen, Tom. I tried to be a good wife, tried to do everything right. But I just can't pretend like everything's okay anymore." She paused, expecting him to yell, to accuse her, but he just looked at her as if he was trying to figure out who she was. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he asked, and there wasn't anger in his words, but something like desperation. Emily shrugged, feeling her own desperation rise in response. "Because I didn't know how. Because I was afraid you wouldn't understand. Because I thought if I kept going, things would work out on their own." Tom shook his head, as if her words were too hard to take. "You're saying you didn't want me. For 5 years," he said, his voice breaking. "What am I supposed to take, Emily? That all this time you were just pretending?" "I wasn't pretending," she countered, feeling her voice grow louder. "I was doing it for us, for our family. I thought it was what it took to keep us together. But I can't be everything to everyone, Tom. I can't be your wife, your mother, your manager, your cook, your cleaner, and still feel alive." He looked at her, and there was so much pain in his eyes that Emily felt guilty. She wanted to go to him, to hug him, to tell him that they could work it out, but something in his eyes stopped her. "I thought we were happy," he said finally, and his voice was so quiet she barely heard it. "I thought I was doing everything right." Emily felt her heart clench. She knew he truly believed it, and that made it worse. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said, trying to sound gentle. "But you didn't see me, Tom. You didn't see how hard it is for me, and I didn't know how to show it to you." Tom turned away, looking out the window, where the dark street was reflected in the glass. He was silent for so long that Emily thought he would say nothing more. But then he turned to her, and his voice was colder than before. "I don't know what to do now, Emily. I really don't know." He left the kitchen, and she heard him go upstairs, and then the slam of their bedroom door. Emily was left alone, feeling her world crumble. She had told the truth, but instead of relief, she had received only pain, his and hers. She knew their marriage would never be the same, and that thought scared her more than she could admit. The morning after their conversation in the kitchen was gray and heavy, like the low clouds over Oak Park. Emily had woken before her alarm at 5:45 and lay in bed, listening to the silence of the house. Tom was asleep next to her, his back to her, his breathing so quiet that for a moment she wondered if he was faking it. Their bedroom, usually cozy, with cream curtains and pictures of their children on the dresser, felt foreign, as if the air were thicker, saturated with unspoken words. Emily stood carefully, trying not to break the floorboards, and went down to the kitchen, where she began making coffee, more out of habit than desire. Her mind raced back to the night before, when she had told Tom the truth about how tired she was, how intimacy had become a chore, how invisible she felt in their family. His reaction, the shock, the hurt, the almost tangible sense of betrayal was still vivid in her mind. He had said he didn't know what to do next and went to bed, leaving her in the kitchen feeling like she'd just set fire to a bridge they'd been walking on for 15 years. Now, in the cold light of morning, Emily wasn't sure if she regretted it or not. Part of her felt relieved that she'd finally been honest, but another part, a large and frightening one, was afraid that this honesty had ruined their marriage. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen island, looking at the pile of school papers that needed to be sorted. She usually started the day by checking off her to-do list, but today her hands weren't moving. She just sat there, clutching her mug, trying to figure out what was coming next. Tom wasn't yelling or accusing her, but his silence was worse than any yelling. It was like a wall, cold and impenetrable, and Emily didn't know how to get through it. Tom came down to the kitchen around 6:30, already dressed for work, a navy suit, a neatly knotted tie, his hair slicked back. His face was expressionless, but there were shadows under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept much. "Good morning," he said, but his voice was flat, without its usual warmth. Emily nodded, feeling something tighten in her chest. "Good," she said, and that was all they said to each other. He poured himself coffee, grabbed some toast from the plate she had prepared, and sat at the table, his head glued to his phone. Emily watched him, hoping he would look up, say something, start a conversation, but he was silent, and that silence was louder than any words. She wanted to speak, to ask him what he was thinking, to apologize for the way she'd said it. But every time she opened her mouth, fear stopped her. What if he said he couldn't live with this? What if he decided their marriage was over? Instead, she got up to make breakfast for the kids, moving on autopilot. She chopped fruit for Sophie, made a sandwich for Lucas, made sure their backpacks were packed. All the while, Tom sat at the table, scrolling through the news, and never once looked at her. When Sophie and Lucas came downstairs, the kitchen was filled with their voices, and for a moment the tension eased. Sophie was complaining about having to rewrite her literature essay, and Lucas was asking if he could take a new ball to practice. Emily answered, smiling, but her thoughts were on Tom, who was silently eating his toast. When he finally got up to leave for work, he kissed the children on the forehead, but walked past Emily without touching her, without saying a word. "See you tonight," he said, more to the air than to her, and closed the door behind him. Emily stood at the sink, listening to his car pull away, and felt her heart clench. It wasn't just silence, it was a chasm that had opened up between them overnight. She knew her words had hurt him, but she hadn't expected him to shut her down so abruptly. Tom, who had always been open, who had laughed at her jokes, who had hugged her when she was upset, was now acting like a stranger, and it scared her more than she could admit. The day passed in its usual bustle. Emily took the kids to school, answered emails from clients, and went grocery shopping. She even found time to finish a pair of earrings for an order, but it all felt mechanical, as if her body was performing tasks while her mind was elsewhere. She kept going back to the conversation from the night before, going over every word, every expression on Tom's face. She tried to figure out what she could have said differently, how she could have softened the blow, but each time she came to the same conclusion. She had been honest, and that was the only truth she could give him. That evening, when Tom came home, nothing had changed. He was polite but distant, like a guest who didn't want to linger. He talked to the children at dinner, asked Sophie about her essay, complimented Lucas on his goal at practice, but with Emily he talked only about mundane things. "We're out of milk," or "Did you make me an appointment with the dentist?" Emily answered briefly, trying not to show how hurt she was by his coldness. She wanted to grab his hand, to make him look at her, to tell him they could fix this. But every time she went to speak, his eyes blank, distant stopped her. After dinner, Tom went down to the basement, saying he had a report to finish. Emily stayed behind to clean the kitchen, feeling a wave of loneliness wash over her. She remembered a few months ago, when they had a similarly tense moment. She had tried to hug him, and he had pulled away, muttering something about a headache. At the time, she had chalked it up to fatigue, but now, after yesterday, she could see that this was not an isolated incident. Tom was shutting her out, and she didn't know how to get through to him. She decided to try to talk. After the kids went to bed, she went down to the basement, where Tom was sitting at his desk, surrounded by blueprints and a laptop. The light from his desk lamp fell on his face, highlighting wrinkles she hadn't noticed before. "Tom," she began, standing in the doorway, "we need to talk." He looked up, and there was such weariness in his eyes that Emily hesitated for a moment, but she forced herself to continue. "I didn't mean for things to turn out this way. I wanted to be honest." Tom leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Honest," he repeated, and there was a bitterness in his voice she hadn't expected. "You said you didn't want me for 5 years, Emily. 5 years, and I'm supposed to just, what? Accept it and move on?" His words were like a slap in the face, and Emily felt her cheeks heat up. "I didn't say I didn't want you," she said, trying to sound calm. "I said I was tired, that it was hard, that I couldn't be everything to everyone. I was trying to keep us together, Tom. I thought I was doing it for us." She paused, waiting for him to answer, but he only looked at her, and his silence was worse than any accusation. "Do you even realize how this sounds to me?" he said finally, his voice low, almost hoarse. "I thought we were close, that we were okay. And now you're telling me that all this time you were just doing your job. How am I supposed to live with that, Emily? How am I supposed to look at you, knowing that you weren't really there for me?" Emily felt the tears sting her eyes, but she clenched her fists, keeping them from falling. I was with you, she said, her voice shaking. I was there every minute, every night, even when it was hard. I did it because I loved you, because I wanted our family to be whole. But you didn't see how hard it was for me, Tom. You didn't ask. He shook his head as if her words were too heavy to bear except. I didn't know, he said, and there was so much pain in his voice that Emily wanted to hug him, but she didn't move. I didn't know, Emily, but now that I know, I'm not sure I can forget it. He stood up, walked past her, and went upstairs, leaving her in the basement. Emily stood there, feeling the cold of the wall behind her sink into her skin. She wanted to scream, to beg him to stay, but she knew it was useless. The days after their conversation in the kitchen passed slowly, as if time in the Walker house in Oak Park had frozen, saturated with tension. Emily woke up each morning feeling like she was walking on thin ice that could crack at any moment. Tom, who had always been the center of their family life with his loud laugh, his habit of teasing Sophie, his habit of throwing Lucas into the air, now seemed a shadow of his former self. He was polite but distant, like a neighbor who stops by to borrow sugar and then hurries away. Emily felt this distance in his every gesture, in the way he avoided her gaze at breakfast, in the way his good morning sounded mechanical, in the way he no longer touched her, either accidentally as he passed by or intentionally, as he used to do when he put his arm around her waist while she cooked dinner. The kitchen, usually full of life, became the place where Emily felt her loneliness most acutely. She continued to do her chores, making breakfast, getting the kids ready for school, checking their homework, but every time Tom walked into the room, her heart sank. She waited for him to speak, for them to sit down and talk it over like adults, like partners, but he was silent. His silence was not angry, but cold, as if he had retreated into himself, leaving Emily outside, knocking on the closed door. She tried to get through to him, asking him about his day, offering to watch a movie together, even leaving him a note reminding him to meet, adding a smiley face, like old times. But Tom answered briefly, monosyllabically, and the smiley face went unanswered. Emily knew that her words about not wanting intimacy and the overload in their marriage had cut him deep. She had seen it in his eyes that night when he told her he didn't know how to live with it. But she hadn't expected his reaction to be like this, not a tantrum, not an argument, but this cold wall that grew with each passing day. She felt guilty, but also angry. Why wouldn't he talk? Why would he just shut himself off instead of trying to understand her? She had been honest, she had revealed her pain to him, and he seemed to take it as a betrayal, as if she had destroyed their marriage single-handedly. A week passed, and the tension became unbearable. Emily noticed that even the children began to sense that something was wrong. Sophie, usually preoccupied with her own affairs, asked one evening at dinner, "Dad, why are you so quiet?" Tom smiled, but it was a strained smile. "Just tired, baby." Lucas, less perceptive but sensitive to moods, began to cuddle up to Emily more often, as if seeking comfort from her. Emily tried to keep it together for their sakes, but inside she was on edge. She couldn't continue to live in this silent hell, where every day was like the last, only harder. On a Friday night, 10 days after their conversation, Emily decided she couldn't go on like this. The kids were in their rooms, Sophie studying for the school play, Lucas playing a video game, and the house was quiet except for the low hum of the television in the living room, where Tom was watching the news. Emily finished cleaning the kitchen and, steeling herself, went to him. She paused in the doorway, looking at his profile, illuminated by the blue light of the screen. His face was tired, but not relaxed like before, but tense, as if he were wearing a mask to hide his thoughts. "Tom," she said, trying to keep her voice firm but not accusatory. He turned his head, his eyes wary, as if he were expecting another blow. "We need to talk." He nodded but left the TV on, which stung Emily, though she tried to ignore it. She sat down on the couch at the opposite end, feeling the distance between them become almost tangible. "I can't do this anymore," she began, looking down at her hands, which were nervously fiddling with the hem of her sweater. "This silence, it's killing me. We can't just pretend that nothing happened." Tom looked at her, but his face remained unreadable. He was silent, and that silence made Emily continue, although each word was difficult. I know my words hurt you. I didn't mean for it to. But I was honest, Tom. I told you how hard it was for me, how alone I felt in our marriage. And instead of talking to me, you just walked away. You won't even look at me. Tom finally turned off the TV, and the silence in the room became deafening. He leaned back against the couch, running a hand over his face as if trying to collect his thoughts. "What do you want me to say, Emily?" he asked, his voice low, almost hoarse. "You said you haven't wanted me for 5 years. 5 years, Emily. Do you even realize how that sounds? Like everything I thought about us was a lie." Emily felt her cheeks heat up. She'd been expecting the accusation, but it still cut like a knife. "It wasn't a lie," she said, trying to keep her voice calm, though her voice shook. "I did it for us, for our family. I thought it was what it took to keep us together. But I can't be everything to everyone, Tom. I'm tired, I'm burned out, and you never even noticed how hard it was for me." He shook his head, as if her words were too hard to take in. "I didn't know," he said, his voice a mixture of hurt and irritation. "You never said anything, Emily. You just pretended everything was okay, and then you dumped it on me, like I was supposed to read your mind. How was I supposed to know?" Emily clenched her fists, feeling the anger rise in her chest. "I tried," she said, her voice growing louder. "I told him I was tired, that I needed help, but you wouldn't listen. You'd come home, sit on the couch, and your day would be over. Mine wasn't. I was alone, Tom, even when you were there." She paused, feeling the tears sting her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She didn't want him to see her weakness, not now. Tom looked at her, and there was something new in his eyes, not just pain, but determination. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and said, "I don't know how we can move forward, Emily. I don't know how I can live with this, with what you said. I can't just forget it and pretend everything's okay." He paused, looking at the floor, and then added, more quietly, "I think we need a break." Emily froze, feeling the blood drain from her face. "A pause?" she asked, her voice barely audible. What does that mean? She knew what he meant, but she needed to hear it from him to believe it. Tom looked up, and there was weariness in his eyes, mingled with something like regret. "I mean, I need time," he said. "Space to figure out what I feel, what we're doing. I can't go on like this, Emily, knowing that all these years you've been just doing your duty. This isn't marriage, I don't know what this is." His words were like a punch to the gut, and Emily felt her world crumble. She had expected anger, an argument, even accusations, but not this. A pause. The word sounded so innocuous, but she knew what it meant, the first step to something far more final. "Do you want to leave?" she asked, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to keep it together. "I don't know what I want," Tom said, and his honesty was almost worse than a lie. "But I know I can't keep pretending everything is okay. I can't look at you and not think about what you said. I need time to sort myself out." Emily felt anger rise above her fear. "Figure yourself out," she repeated, her voice sharper. "What about me, Tom? I was honest. I opened up to you, and you just walked away. You're leaving me because you can't handle the truth. It's not fair." She stood up, her hands shaking. "I sacrificed myself for this family, for us, and you just want a break because you're hurt." Tom stood up too, his face hardening. "Not fair," he said, his voice louder than before. "You're telling me you pretended in our bed for 5 years, and I'm supposed to just swallow it and move on. Do you have any idea how much this is breaking me, Emily? I thought we were close, that we were a team, and now I don't know what was real." Emily wanted to scream, to tell him it was real, that she loved him, that she was doing this for their family, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she just looked at him, feeling the gap between them widen. "So what now?" she asked finally, her voice almost a whisper. "You're just going to leave, and what? Leave me with the kids, with the house, with everything." Tom turned away, looking out the dark window where their silhouettes were reflected. "I don't know," he said, his voice lower. But I can't stay here until I figure it out. I'll get an apartment for a while. We'll, we'll figure out how to explain to the kids." He fell silent, and Emily felt her heart sink into emptiness. She wanted to beg him to stay, to tell him they could fix this, but pride or maybe exhaustion stopped her. Instead, she nodded, feeling something inside her break. "Okay," she said, and her voice was cold, as if it belonged to someone else. "If you need a break, take it." Tom looked at her, and there was so much pain in his eyes that Emily almost regretted her words. But he said nothing, just nodded and went upstairs, leaving her in the living room. Emily sank down on the sofa, feeling the tears finally streaming down her cheeks. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew that their marriage as she knew it had ended the moment Tom suggested a break, and she wasn't sure if she had the strength to pick up the pieces. Morning light filtered through the curtains of Emily's bedroom, painting the walls a soft golden hue. It was 6:15 am, and the house in Oak Park seemed too quiet, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, where the tiny crack she'd noticed last summer seemed to have grown just a little longer. She'd been up most of the night, replaying in her mind Tom's words about taking a break from their marriage, his decision to rent an apartment, his withdrawal from their life together. That had been a week ago, and since then their home, once full of noise and warmth, had become a place where every step echoed with loneliness. Tom moved out 3 days after their conversation. He packed a suitcase with clothes, a laptop, and a few books, saying he'd pick up the rest later. Emily stood in the bedroom doorway, watching him methodically fold shirts, and felt her heart clench. She wanted to scream, to beg him to stay, but pride or maybe fear of final refusal held her back. "I'll call the kids," he said without looking at her, and added, "We'll figure out how to make it work." Emily nodded, though his words sounded formal, as if his mind was already elsewhere. They explained to the children that Dad needed a little time to sort out his work and that he would be living nearby. Sophie, with her teenage insight, looked at Emily suspiciously but said nothing, just went into her room, slamming the door loudly. Lucas, on the other hand, was confused, asking when Dad would be back, and Emily, with difficulty choosing her words, promised that soon they would all go to the pizza place together like before. She knew it was a lie, but she couldn't stand the look of disappointment on his face. Now, a week later, Emily was trying to adjust to her new reality. She got up in the morning, made breakfast, took the kids to school, worked on orders for her jewelry business, but it all felt like a blur. Her movements were automatic, as if she were playing the role of mother and hostess, but inside she felt empty. The house she had so carefully decorated with flowers on the windowsills, family photos on the walls, children's drawings on the refrigerator felt alien, like the set for a play that had ended. The morning passed in the usual bustle. Emily made porridge for Sophie, toast for Lucas, checked their backpacks, and reminded Sophie about rehearsing the school play. The children were quieter than usual, and Emily noticed them sneaking glances at her, as if waiting for her to explain why Dad wasn't home. She smiled and joked, but her voice was strained, and she knew Sophie noticed. When the school bus left, Emily returned to the kitchen and sat at the table, staring at her empty coffee cup. She should have been answering client emails, but instead she just sat there, feeling tired and lonely. Tom called the kids every night, and those calls were the only reminders of his existence. Emily heard Lucas cheerfully tell him about practice, and Sophie shared gossip about school, and each time it cut her like a knife. Tom was there, in his new apartment, 5 miles away, but to Emily he seemed as far away as if he had moved to another continent. He didn't call her, didn't write, and that silence was the worst of all. She wanted to know what he was thinking, if he missed her, if he regretted his decision, but her pride wouldn't let her take the first step. That afternoon, Emily went to a local fair, where she'd rented a booth to sell her jewelry. It was her first event since Tom left, and she hoped the work would distract her. The fair was in a park, with awnings filled with crafts, food, and flowers. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and hot dogs, and the crowds buzzed around her families, couples, children running around with balloons. Emily laid out her earrings, necklaces, and bracelets, trying to smile at the shoppers, but her mind was elsewhere. She watched couples holding hands, fathers throwing children into the air, and each moment reminded her of what she'd lost. A woman in her 40s, with bright red hair and a kind smile, approached her. "What beautiful earrings," she said, examining a pair of turquoise ones. Emily thanked her, and they began to talk. The woman, who introduced herself as Claire, explained that she had recently been divorced and was enjoying her freedom. "It's hard at first," she said, looking at Emily with understanding, "but then you realize you can breathe." Emily nodded, but inside she felt a pang of pain. She didn't want a divorce, she didn't want freedom, she wanted their family to be whole, for Tom to come back, for everything to go back to the way it had been. But Claire's words stuck in her head like a splinter, and she couldn't stop thinking about them. That evening, when Emily returned home, she found Sophie and Lucas had gone to Tom's. He had taken them for the weekend, as they had agreed, but Emily hadn't been prepared for how empty the house would feel without them. She walked from room to room, touching their things, Sophie's schoolbook on the table, Lucas's football by the door, and felt tears welling in her eyes. She hadn't cried since the night Tom had suggested a break, but now, in the silence of the empty house, she couldn't hold back. She sat on the sofa, hugging her knees, and let the tears that had been building for weeks flow. Her business, which had always been her outlet, was starting to suffer too. She missed a deadline for one order, forgot to respond to an email from a customer, and her Etsy sales dropped because she wasn't updating her catalog. They were still getting by financially. Tom was still transferring money into a family account, but Emily knew it couldn't go on forever. She felt like her life, so organized and stable, was falling apart, and she didn't know how to stop it. On Saturday night, Sophie called to tell her about her bowling trip with Tom. She sounded enthusiastic, and Emily tried to smile as she described Lucas dropping a bowling ball on his foot. "Daddy's so funny," Sophie said, and Emily felt a twinge of jealousy. Why would Tom be fun and carefree with the kids, but not with her? Why had he gone off, leaving her to deal with this pain alone? She wanted to ask Sophie what his apartment looked like, what he said about her, but instead she simply said, "That sounds great, honey. See you tomorrow." When the kids returned on Sunday, Emily noticed that they were different, not sullen, but distant. Lucas gave her a hug, but quickly went off to play, and Sophie went straight up to her room, saying she had a test to study for. Emily felt like they were slipping away from her. That time with Tom, free of her stress and fatigue, was preferable to them. She tried not to take it personally, but every time Lucas said, "Daddy said," or Sophie mentioned the time they'd had pizza at Tom's, Emily felt her connection with the kids weaken. She decided to text Tom to set up a schedule, but her fingers froze over the keyboard. What could she say? "Please come back." "Sorry, I was honest." Instead, she wrote a short message. "We need to discuss how we're going to split time with the kids. When are you free?" An hour later, his reply came, dry and businesslike. "Wednesday after work. I'll stop by." Emily read it and felt something break inside. This wasn't her Tom, not the man who'd once danced with her in the kitchen to an old Frank Sinatra song. This was a stranger, a man who spoke to her like a coworker, not a wife. By Wednesday, Emily was trying to prepare for the meeting, but her thoughts were in a tangle. She wanted to be calm, rational, but every time she pictured Tom sitting across from her, her heart sank. When he arrived, she opened the door and paused for a moment when she saw him. He looked the same, but different. His eyes were tired, and the smile he usually gave her was missing. "Hello," he said, and Emily nodded, ushering him into the house. They sat at the kitchen table, and Emily felt the tension thicken. They discussed a schedule. Tom would pick up the kids on weekends and one night a week, but the conversation was formal, as if they were signing a contract. Emily wanted to ask him how he was, if he was bored, but his distance stopped her. When he left, she stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty chair where he had sat, feeling her life, so familiar and stable, continue to fall apart. Emily sat in an overstuffed chair in her marriage therapist's office, staring at the pattern of the carpet beneath her feet. The room was cozy, with pastel walls, shelves full of books, and a vase of lavender on the table, but Emily felt out of place. Across from her, in another chair, sat Tom, his posture tense, his arms crossed over his chest. The therapist, Dr. Linda Carter, a woman in her 50s with a warm smile and piercing eyes, watched them, a notepad in her lap. It was their third session in a month, and Emily, who had insisted on therapy in the hopes of saving their marriage, was beginning to feel like they were treading water. The air in the room was thick with tension, like before a storm, and Emily didn't know how to dispel the clouds. It had been 6 weeks since Tom had moved into his apartment 5 miles from their home in Oak Park. The weeks had been a grind for Emily. She'd get up, make the kids breakfast, take them to school, work on orders for her jewelry business, clean the house, but it had all been a blur. Her life, once organized and predictable, now felt chaotic, and she clung to routine to keep from losing herself. The children, Sophie and Lucas, had been spending the weekends with Tom, and each time they returned, Emily noticed them becoming a little more distant. Sophie, with her teenage reserve, responded in monosyllables, and Lucas, usually talkative, had become quieter, as if he were afraid he'd say the wrong thing. Emily felt like she was losing them, and the feeling was worse than the loneliness she'd felt without Tom. The idea for therapy came to her 2 weeks after he left. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, and realized she couldn't continue to live in this limbo where Tom was neither with her nor without her. She wrote to him, suggesting they try couples therapy, and to her surprise, he agreed. If it helps the kids, he wrote back, and Emily, though stung by his failure to mention their marriage, jumped at the chance. She found Dr. Carter through a friend's recommendation and signed up for her first session, hoping that a professional could help them sort out what had gone wrong. The first session was awkward but encouraging. Dr. Carter asked them to share why they were there, and Emily, steeling herself, explained how she felt overwhelmed, invisible, how their intimacy had become a chore, their marriage a chore. She tried to speak calmly, but her voice shook as she mentioned how her honesty about not wanting intimacy had led to the breakup. Tom, for his part, was guarded. He said he felt betrayed, that her words about 5 years of pretending had destroyed his vision of their marriage. I don't know what was real, he said, looking at the floor, and Emily felt her heart sink. Dr. Carter listened, took notes, and suggested that they work on communication, but Emily left the room feeling like they were just starting to dig themselves into a hole they weren't sure how to get out of. Now, in their third session, Emily felt like their progress had stalled. Dr. Carter began by asking, "How was your week? What did you notice about your feelings or interactions?" Emily looked at Tom, hoping he would speak first, but he remained silent, looking at his hands. She sighed and began, "I try to keep everything under control, like I always do. The kids, the house, my business. But it's hard when we don't talk. I feel alone, even when you call the kids." Her voice was quiet, but there was a pain in it that she could no longer hide. Tom finally looked up, but his eyes were distant. "I call the kids every day," he said, and there was something defensive in his tone. "I try to be there for them, even when I'm not home. I don't know what you want from me, Emily. You said it was hard for you, that you were faking it. I gave you space. Isn't that what you wanted?" Emily felt anger flare in her chest. "Space," she repeated, her voice sharper. "I didn't ask you to leave, Tom. I wanted us to talk, to let you understand how hard it was for me. And then you just left, and now I'm dealing with this alone while you live your life in your apartment." She paused, feeling tears sting her eyes, but she brushed them away, not wanting to show weakness. Dr. Carter intervened, her voice calm but firm. "Emily, I hear your pain. Tom, can you share how you feel when Emily says that?" Tom sat back in his chair, his face tense. I don't know," he said, his voice low, almost hoarse. "I feel like everything I knew about our marriage was a lie. She says she pretended for 5 years that she didn't want me. How am I supposed to live with that? I thought we were close, and now I don't know who she is." Emily felt his words cut like a knife. "I wasn't pretending," she said, her voice shaking. "I was doing this for us, for our family. I was there, Tom, even when I was down. But you didn't see me drowning. You didn't ask if I was okay. And now you blame me for being honest." She looked at Dr. Carter, hoping she'd back her up, but the therapist just nodded, taking notes. Tom, can you respond to what Emily is saying? Dr. Carter asked. Tom shook his head as if the words were too hard to say. I don't know what to say, he said finally. I didn't know it was that hard for her. But now that I know, I can't just forget it. I look at her and I think, what else wasn't true? Was she even happy with me? Emily felt her heart squeeze. She wanted to scream that she was happy, that she loved him, that everything she did was for their family, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she said, I was happy, Tom, but I couldn't be everything to everyone. I couldn't be the perfect wife, mother, businesswoman, and still feel alive. I tried to talk to you, but you wouldn't listen. Tom turned away, looking out the window where the rain was streaking the glass. I didn't know, he repeated, his voice a mixture of hurt and irritation. You never said anything straight, Emily. You just pretended everything was fine, and then you dumped it on me. I can't read minds. Dr. Carter raised her hand, stopping them. I can see that you both feel betrayed, she said. Emily, you feel like your efforts have been overlooked, and Tom, you feel like you've been cheated. This is a tough place to be, but it's a place where we can start working. Can you both think about what you'd like to change about your interactions? Emily nodded, but her hope was fading. She wanted Tom to understand, to come back, to be a family again, but his words, I don't know who she is, rang in her mind like a death sentence. The rest of the session was spent discussing small details, how they shared time with the kids, how they managed household chores. But every time Emily tried to return to their marriage, to their feelings, Tom withdrew, saying he needed time. Dr. Carter suggested homework, sharing one thought or feeling each day, but Emily knew Tom wouldn't do it. He had already walled himself off from her, and therapy, which was supposed to be a bridge, felt like another wall. The rain had picked up as they left the office, and they walked to their cars in silence. Emily wanted to say something, to ask how he was, but his distant gaze stopped her. I'll see you on Saturday, he said, meaning when he'd pick up the kids, and he got into the car. Emily stood in the rain, feeling the drops running down her face, mixing with her tears. She got into her car and turned on the radio to drown out the silence, but the song Something About Love and Loss only made her hurt worse. At home, she continued her routine, but each day was harder than the last. The kids spent more time with Tom, and Emily noticed how animated they became when they talked about his apartment, about playing board games or eating pizza. She tried not to be jealous, but every time Lucas said, Daddy said, she felt her connection with them weaken. Her business was suffering, too. She was missing deadlines, and the reviews on Etsy were less glowing. She was still holding up financially, but she knew that without Tom's income, she would have to make some changes. Emily clung to therapy like a lifeline, but with each session her hope faded. Tom came and talked, but his words were empty, as if he were doing something he was obligated to do rather than trying to save their marriage. Emily, Yauch would give it her all, telling him how tired she was, how lonely she was, how she wanted to be close to him again, but she would run into his wall every time. She began to wonder if she should continue, but the thought of giving up scared her even more. When Emily returned home from the session, she sat at the kitchen table, looking at the picture of their family on the refrigerator. They were smiling as they stood on the shore of Lake Michigan, and Emily remembered how, just 2 years ago, she had still believed that they could make it. Now she wasn't sure if there was any hope left for them, and that feeling, a mixture of desperation and determination, was the only thing keeping her going. Chapter 12. The Inevitable Divorce. Emily sat at the kitchen table in their Oak Park home, staring at the stack of bills that needed to be paid. Morning light streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, but the warmth of the sun did nothing to melt the chill in her chest. It had been 6 months since Tom had moved out and 3 months since they had started couples therapy, but the hope Emily had held on her was fading with each session. Conversations with Dr. Carter had become endless exchanges of accusations. Emily talking about her fatigue and loneliness, Tom about feeling betrayed by her admission of not wanting intimacy. They were not moving forward, and Emily felt like their marriage was slipping through her fingers like sand. Last night, after another fruitless session, Tom said the words she dreaded most. They were sitting in Dr. Carter's office, and when the therapist asked if they saw a future together, Tom looked at the floor and said, "I'm not sure I can continue. I want to file for divorce." His voice was quiet but determined, and Emily felt her world crumble. She wanted to protest, to beg him to reconsider, but instead she simply nodded, feeling something inside her break. Dr. Carter suggested they talk about it, but Emily barely heard her words. All she could think was that their 15-year marriage, everything she had sacrificed for, was over. Now, sitting in the kitchen, Emily tried to make sense of her new reality. Tom hadn't come home from the session he'd gone to his apartment, leaving her alone with the silence that had become her constant companion. She didn't cry, though tears stung her eyes. Instead, she felt a strange mix of anger and devastation. Anger at Tom for giving in, for not being able to handle her honesty. Devastation that she'd lost not just her husband, but her family as she'd known it. Emily stood up to pour herself a cup of coffee, but stopped at the refrigerator where a picture of their family hung: Sophie, Lucas, her, and Tom, smiling on Lake Michigan. She pulled the picture down and ran her finger over Tom's face, trying to remember the last time they'd been this happy. She wanted to blame him, but she knew the truth was more complicated. She'd been honest when she said she was tired, that their closeness had become a duty, but maybe she'd stayed silent for too long, letting the hurt build. And Tom, for his part, hadn't seen her pain until it was too late. The kids were at school, and Emily knew she'd have to tell them soon. They were already feeling the strain. Sophie had become withdrawn, often locking herself in her room, and Lucas was asking questions like, "Is Daddy coming back?" Emily tried to protect them, but she knew the divorce would change their lives. She was afraid they'd choose Tom, whose apartment was a stress-free place where they played board games and ate pizza. The thought of losing not only Tom but the kids was unbearable. She opened her laptop to check her Etsy orders, but instead found herself searching for divorce information. The words property division, child custody, alimony sounded like they belonged in someone else's life, but they were hers now. She knew Tom would be fair. He was already transferring money into the family account, but the idea of dividing their lives like old furniture made her feel sick. She closed her laptop and looked out the window, where her neighbor was walking her dog and the world was going on as if nothing had changed. That evening, she called her friend Lisa, the only person she could be honest with. Lisa, divorced for 2 years, listened without interrupting. "You did the best you could," she said when Emily finished. "Sometimes the truth is freeing, but that doesn't mean it's going to be easy." Emily nodded, even though Lisa couldn't see her, and felt a single tear roll down her cheek. She didn't want freedom, she wanted her family, but she knew that the family she had known no longer existed. When Tom stopped by the next day to pick up the kids for the weekend, Emily met him at the door. His eyes were tired but determined. "I'll talk to the lawyer next week," he said, and Emily nodded, feeling her throat tighten. "Okay," she said, and that was all she could say. He picked up Sophie and Lucas, and Emily watched his car drive away, feeling the last thread connecting them snap. She walked back into the kitchen and sat at the table where the same stack of bills lay. She knew she had to move forward for the children, for herself, but every step seemed too far to bear. Divorce was inevitable, but Emily wasn't prepared for what it would take with it. Not just Tom, but her sense of who she was. She took the photo from the refrigerator and put it in a drawer, unable to look at their smiling faces any longer. Their marriage was over, and now she had to learn to live with that truth, no matter how painful it was. Chapter 13. Tom's New Life. Emily sat in her studio, surrounded by beads and wire, but her hands lay limply on the table. Outside the Oak Park window, a light rain fell, the drops pattering against the glass in a monotonous rhythm. It had been 2 years since their divorce, and Emily's life had changed beyond recognition. The house, once full of family, now seemed too big for her alone. Sophie and Lucas were spending more time with Tom, and Emily was struggling with the feeling that she was losing them. Her jewelry business was struggling, with orders down and financial stress a constant companion. But the hardest blow had been the news Sophie had delivered last night. Emily was peeling potatoes for dinner when Sophie walked into the kitchen, beaming with excitement. "Mom, you're not going to believe it. Dad proposed to Caitlin," she blurted out, showing a photo on her phone of Tom on one knee, holding out a ring to a young woman with long blonde hair. Emily froze, the knife falling from her hand, but she quickly caught herself, forcing a smile. "That's great, honey," she said, though her insides were clenching. Sophie went on and on about how beautiful the sunset had been, how Caitlin had cried tears of happiness, but Emily barely heard. She nodded until Sophie went into her room, then sank into a chair, feeling her world crumble all over again. Now, in the quiet of the studio, she opened her laptop and couldn't resist finding Caitlin's Instagram account. Caitlin, a yoga teacher, was Emily's polar opposite, energetic, with an infectious smile, surrounded by friends in every photo. Her posts were full of light dawn yoga classes, dinners with girlfriends, strolls around Chicago with Tom. In one photo, she and Tom were standing by Lake Michigan, his arm around her waist, looking at her with a tenderness Emily hadn't seen in their marriage, even at its best. She closed the laptop, feeling a searing ache rise in her chest. Tom had found the happiness he thought he couldn't have with her. Caitlin was everything Emily couldn't be, free, alive, unburdened by years of weariness and resentment. Emily didn't blame her. Caitlin had done nothing wrong, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been replaced, that her sacrifices, her years of fighting for her family, had been erased by this new, shining love. She remembered their last therapy session, when Tom had said he didn't know what was real in their marriage. Now, looking at his smile in the photo, she realized that he had found his real life without her. Sophie and Lucas had come home from Tom's last week, talking about how much fun they'd had at his apartment, how Caitlin had taught them how to make smoothies and play charades. Emily had listened, trying to smile, but every story had been a sting. The kids loved Caitlin, and that made the pain even worse. Sophie had even mentioned that Caitlin was helping her with rehearsals for the school play, and Emily had felt her role as a mother slipping away. She knew she should be happy for Tom, for the kids, but instead she felt defeated, like she'd lost a game she didn't understand the rules of. She stood up and went to the window, looking out at the wet street. The rain was getting heavier, and Emily thought that her life now resembled this gray, endless downpour. She had tried dating men after her divorce, but every date had ended in disappointment. No one could understand her pain, her responsibility for the children, her fatigue. She downsized to a smaller apartment to cope with the finances, but even that didn't ease the stress. And Tom, by all accounts, was thriving. His new life with Caitlin was like a postcard, bright, perfect, unattainable. Emily returned to the table and picked up a pair of unfinished earrings, but her hands were shaking. She knew she had to move forward, but every step felt like a betrayal of Emily, who had once believed in their family. She opened the drawer where their old family photograph lay and looked at Tom, smiling, carefree. Now he was smiling at another woman. Emily sat on the couch in her small Oak Park apartment, clutching a mug of cold tea. It was drizzling outside, and the gray light barely filtered through the thin curtains, making the room even more depressing. It had been 2 weeks since Sophie had told her about Tom's engagement to Caitlin, and those weeks had been like an endless nightmare for Emily. Her life, already fragile after the divorce, was beginning to crumble even faster. The financial stress, the struggle to survive with her jewelry business, the loneliness, it was all hard. But the most painful thing was the feeling that she was losing her children, Sophie and Lucas. The flat Emily moved into after selling their family home was cramped, with worn hardwood floors and a kitchen barely big enough for two. She tried to make it cozy, potted herbs on the windowsill, Lucas's drawings on the fridge, but it didn't help. Sophie, now 15, only spent mandatory days at Emily's, often locked in her room with her phone. Lucas, 11, was more affectionate, but his questions about his dad and Caitlin cut Emily like knives. The children increasingly chose Tom's house for its fun and stability, and Emily couldn't blame them, but that didn't make the pain any less acute. Last night, Lucas had dealt her the biggest blow. They were sitting down to dinner a simple pasta with sauce from a jar because Emily didn't have the energy to cook anything complicated. Lucas picked at his food with his fork, and then, without looking up, he said, "Mom, can I live with Dad and Caitlin? They're, well, it's safer there, and I don't have to worry about money." His voice was quiet, but every word was a blow. Emily froze, feeling the blood drain from her face. She wanted to ask him what he meant, but she knew the answer. Her stress, her constant calls to clients, her struggles to make ends meet were visible, and Lucas, despite his age, could sense it. "You want to live with Dad?" she asked, trying to keep her voice from shaking. Lucas nodded, looking down at his plate. "It's not that I don't love you, Mom. It's just easier." Emily swallowed and forced a smile. "We'll talk about it, okay?" she said, and Lucas nodded, clearly relieved that the conversation was over. After dinner, she went into the bathroom, turned on the water, and let her tears flow so the kids wouldn't hear. Now, sitting on the couch, Emily turned over the conversation in her head. Lucas was right. Tom and Caitlin had it safer. Their home, which Emily had only seen in photos, was spacious, with a large kitchen where Caitlin taught the kids to bake cupcakes and a living room where they played board games. Tom, freed from the stress of their marriage, had become the best version of himself, funny, attentive, the kind of dad the kids adored. Caitlin added a lighter touch, her energy and laughter making their home a place Sophie and Lucas could visit every weekend. Emily, with her small apartment and endless bills, couldn't compete. Hers was a home full of love, but also anxiety, and the kids were magnets for the easy stuff. Sophie was growing distant, too. She visited Emily on schedule, but her mind was elsewhere. Last week, she told Emily how Caitlin had helped her pick out a dress for the school play, and Emily had felt a twinge of jealousy. She'd always been the one who helped Sophie with her costumes, who'd stayed up until midnight rehearsing her lines. But now Caitlin had taken over that role, and Emily felt her place in Sophie's life shrinking. Sophie didn't say it out loud, but Emily could tell she was more comfortable with Tom, where she didn't have to worry about having enough money for a new pair of sneakers or school supplies. Emily stood up and went to the window, looking out at the wet street. She remembered how, in their old house, she and the children had baked cookies on winter evenings, Lucas spreading the dough on the table and Sophie decorating it with icing. Those moments seemed so far away, as if they belonged to another life. Now the children preferred Tom's house, and Emily didn't know how to bring them back. She tried to be cheerful, had movie nights, bought them their favorite foods, but her stress seeped into every gesture, and the children sensed it. She opened her laptop to check her Etsy orders, but instead found an email from Tom's lawyer. They had been discussing changes to their custody schedule, and now that Lucas had spoken, Emily knew he would probably ask to officially live with their father. The thought was like a punch to the gut. She knew she had to fight for her children, but how could she fight when they were choosing a different life? She closed her laptop and pressed her palms to her eyes, feeling the loneliness pressing in on her. Emily remembered Tom promising to be with her through thick and thin at their wedding. She had believed they would be a team, but now, standing in her tiny apartment, she felt like she was the only one bearing the pain. The children she had sacrificed herself for were slipping away, preferring the stability and joy of Tom and Caitlin's home. She didn't blame them, they were children seeking warmth, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her love, her efforts, hadn't been enough. She picked up her phone and pulled up a photo of Sophie and Lucas laughing at the fair 2 years ago. They had been a family then, despite the cracks in their marriage. Now those cracks were a chasm, and Emily didn't know how to bridge it. She put the phone down and looked at her hands, still covered in wire from making the decorations. She needed to find a way to hold on to the kids, to hold on to herself, but every step felt like an impossible task. The rain outside was getting heavier, and Emily felt it washing away the last vestiges of hope in her. Emily sat on the narrow bed in her small apartment in Oak Park, staring at the box of jewelry she hadn't managed to sell at the last fair. It was getting dark outside, and the streetlights were coming on one by one, casting a dim light on the wet pavement. The silence in the apartment was almost tangible, broken only by the occasional noise of the cars outside. Sophie and Lucas were at Tom and Caitlin's, and their absence felt like an emptiness Emily couldn't fill. It had been 2 weeks since Lucas had asked to live with his father, and a week since Sophie had started spending only one day a week at Emily's, citing schoolwork. Emily felt like her life, once full of family, had turned into a series of lonely evenings, and the thought was more than she could bear. She stood and went to the kitchen table where a stack of bills lay: rent, electricity, school supplies. Her jewelry business was losing money, and Emily knew she would soon have to find a part-time job, perhaps at a cafe or a store. The financial stress was constant, but it paled next to the pain of losing her children. Lucas had formally asked through Tom's lawyer to let Caitlin live with him, and Sophie, though she hadn't said it out loud, had made it clear she was more comfortable in their home. Emily didn't argue she had seen her children flourish in the absence of her worries, her fatigue, her struggles. But every time they left, she felt a part of her heart being torn away. Emily opened the drawer where she kept old family photos and pulled out a picture from Lake Michigan taken 4 years ago. It showed her, Tom, Sophie, and Lucas laughing in the sand, their hair blowing in the wind. She had believed then that their marriage could be saved, that her sacrifices, the endless to-do lists, the silent consent to intimacy, the maintenance of a perfect facade would hold them together. But the night she confessed to Tom that she was tired and unwilling to be intimate had changed everything. Her honesty, which she had thought was liberating, had been the bomb that had destroyed their lives. Now, looking at the photo, she realized that the truth had cost her not only her marriage, but her children, her home, and herself. She remembered finding out about Tom's engagement to Caitlin. Sophie had shown her a photo of Tom beaming with his arms around Caitlin, and Emily had felt her world crumble all over again. Caitlin had been everything Emily couldn't be: vibrant, full of energy, unburdened by years of resentment and fatigue. The kids adored her, telling stories of her teaching them yoga, cooking with them, laughing at their jokes. Tom, freed from their marriage, had become the best version of himself: considerate, funny, everything Emily had always wanted him to be. But this new version wasn't for her, it was for Caitlin, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she had been replaced. She put the photo back in the drawer and walked to the window, looking out. The rain had stopped, but the puddles reflected the streetlights, creating an illusion of light in the darkness. Emily thought about her honesty 4 years ago. She didn't regret telling the truth: their marriage was doomed, full of silent compromises and invisible cracks. But the price of that truth was higher than she could have imagined. She had lost Tom, who had found happiness with someone else. She had lost her children, who had chosen his home over her stress. She had lost her home, her friends, her stability, and now she stood on the edge, unsure of how to move forward. Emily returned to her desk and opened her laptop to check her Etsy orders, but instead began writing an email she would never send. Tom, she began, I don't regret being honest. I told the truth because I couldn't pretend anymore, but I didn't expect it to cost me everything. She paused, tears stinging her eyes, but continued, You found your new life, and I'm happy for you, I really am. But I don't know how to find mine. She closed the document without saving and turned off her laptop. She thought about the future. She needed to find a job to cover the bills. She needed to learn how to be the mother her children would want, despite her small apartment and her worries. She needed to find herself not a wife, not a mother, but Emily, the woman who once dreamed of design, of travel, of a life full of meaning. But every step toward that future felt daunting, as if she were carrying the weight of her losses on her shoulders. Emily stood and walked to the mirror in the hallway. Her reflection was pale, with dark circles under her eyes, but there was something new in her gaze: not hope, but determination. She knew she couldn't go back to the past, couldn't make her children choose her, couldn't erase the pain of Tom finding happiness with Caitlin. But she could stop being a victim of her own honesty. She could start building a new life, however slowly, however hard, but her own. She picked up her phone and texted Lisa, her friend, Want to meet for coffee tomorrow? I need to talk. Lisa responded almost immediately, Sure, 10 a.m. at our cafe. Emily smiled, feeling a tiny ray of light for the first time in weeks. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.